Bronson, welcome back to Moment of Zen.
Glad to be back.
So I wanted to bring you back because I wanted to hone in on a few points we talked about related to immigration. One is, why shouldn't America be this sort of almost draft where we take the best people from all over the world and bring them into our economy? I understand why we shouldn't have, criminals from other places or refugees who don't have a ton of skills necessarily, who aren't adding a ton to our culture or economy. But why shouldn't we take all the brilliant people in the world who want to come here and assimilate them? Isn't that the story of America? Isn't that what we've done?
Kind of. So there's what we could ideally do, and then there's what is like practicable policy. There's a phrase that is often used, which is comprehensive immigration reform. And like if you've paid attention, basically for the last 20 years, this phrase keeps getting used. And it's a fake phrase, right? What the person who's using it, who is typically a politician, is trying to say is, I have large donors in the agricultural industry, meat process, everything from farming to meat processing, different construction concerns, and they want cheap labor. And they have a lot of, quote, undocumented workers. They have illegal aliens working for them, and they want to be able to hire people more easily. They don't want to go through the whole, rigmarole of, well, these people don't have I-9 documents, but whatever, we'll get them in. And, they want to project seriousness about solving immigration. There's another group of people who, typically in tech, who will be like, look, Rajender, our engineer, is like super talented. He's really, really smart, and he's on an OPT, visa, and that's gonna run out. And it's like, but he's critical to our company's success. And how come I can't get this guy who, works with us, is a valued team member, maybe even a co-founder, like why can't this person be here in the United States? And then there is everyone on the side of, the long running immigration debate, who looks around at the country and they're like, why are there 25 million just random people in this country? And how come we can never do anything to just like stop letting them in and like actually get a lot of these people out? In an ideal world, you would have basically a sliding scale. I'll tell you my ideal immigration system, right? And it would be, when you're talking about thousands of people, all you care about is their achievement, and just like how far, out of the distribution this person is, how amazing they are, what their achievements are. These are singular talents. It's a planet of 8 billion people. And we want, the thousands of the people who are just at the very top of their game, we want them here, right? And, then at the tens of thousands, annually, we really want some basic standards of competence. We want them to be assimilable, right? Like these people have to have college degrees. They have to have jobs lined up. They have to be able to speak English, right? At the scale of hundreds of thousands, we still want all of these basic things taken care of, but like these people really like, if hundreds of thousands of people are going to come a year, I mean, what do they think about the Second Amendment? What do they think about the First Amendment? You know, are they native English speakers, right? There are a lot of people around the world who are actually native English speakers, millions and millions of people in the United Kingdom, in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, Australia, New Zealand. Lots of people like that. We should prioritize them. And then, if you're talking about millions of people a year, I think that's basically a mistake. Because if you have a country of 350 million, most of life is basically lived in between the ages of 30 to 60. That's when, you're kind of in your prime working years as an adult. You have all kinds of concerns, and, that population of people is maybe 100 million. So millions of people a year, that's a mistake basically. So going from, low thousands to tens of thousands annually, the scale is like, on the one hand, you have, bizarro accented third culture kids from nowhere who are just like, idiot savants. And, maybe they're like the top Diablo player in the world and they build rockets, right? You have like those people, and you actually want thousands of them, right? It would just totally transform your economy. And then at the hundreds of thousands of level, it's like, if 100,000 people a year from England, like if English people from England or Welsh people from Wales or Scottish people from Scotland or like Anglo-Australians showed up in the United States, 150,000 of them every single year, it would be fine. It would be fine, right? Like we'd make fun of them for saying things like Lori, and then it would just be over in a generation. And so, what this is getting at is, if you're going for quality, you're inherently not going for quantity. And that's just not the that's not how the immigration debate ever goes when people say we want comprehensive immigration reform. Why can't we recruit the best, right? And what happens is a lot of people who in the tech community are like, look, I just want like my really awesome engineer. And I'm like, yeah, I would love for you to have your really awesome engineer. The moral desirability of that, the economic and moral desirability of that, because it is basically crazy, right? That like someone who would assimilate and would contribute can't get here, and then like a bajillion illegal aliens who just cross the border can. That is used to launder just cheap nannies and cheap landscapers. And that's basically the problem. And this idea of doing a grand bargain of, oh, we'll have some enforcement against illegal immigration, but then we legalize a bunch of different people. This has been repeated so many times. And it's just like Charlie Brown trying to, kick the football, and then Lucy pulls it away at the last second. And it never works out, by all kinds of legal and judicial shenanigans. It never works out that there's any immigration restriction or any enforcement of reasonable laws. And there's always just, a mass churn of legalized immigrants to suit, kind of unscrupulous people.
Now we have Elon and Vivek. Why couldn't it be different? Why couldn't we?
Right. Yeah. I hope it's different. My understanding is that Elon and Vivek will be, both immigrant and immigrant origin, as I am, as, in a way you are as well. Right. My understanding is that they will be focused, like just hyper focused on Doge, for the first, ideally like 6 months. And they're just ripping out. They're like, afuera, like, Department of Education, afuera. Right. And, that doesn't really interact with this debate, which is, okay, if we want to have any immigration, what is the basis on which immigration is even legal or illegal in the first place, right? So I'm sure they'll have input, but I don't know if that's the thing that they're going to be working on.
And so what you're basically saying is you agree with me basically on what the ideal would be, that we would take the brilliant people from all over the world, or people productive to our economy more broadly, but you think that it's you can't really disentangle the brilliant people from the less productive people, and we just don't have room for them, or bring.
It's not that we don't have room for them. It's that, how coarse can I be?
Don't hold back.
No, I won't use the analogy. I'm thinking, look, very frequently people will make this calculus with themselves where they're like, I'll just have one Pringle, but the reality is they don't have just one Pringle. No one has just one Pringle. And, until we actually get control of the border, until we actually get control of, 25 million people is a lot of people. California was changed forever by illegal immigration. And a lot of those, I mean, they're the 1986 IRCA, which was a mass amnesty of about 5 million illegal aliens, because there were attendant things called family fairness and whatnot. About 5 million illegal aliens got citizenship. Those people had children, and they have had grandchildren at this point. And all of those people are eligible U.S. citizen voters because of the 1982 Plyler decision that, states have interpreted, I think, incorrectly, to say that, oh yeah, the children of illegal aliens are also citizens. Yeah, it's a strained reading of the 14th Amendment. Yeah, Michael Anton has a very good article on why that's probably not true, and it should come before the court. But they really did change California forever. There's a great article in ABC News. It was published in 2013. I think the economist Chishti is cited in it. And mainstream news organizations just totally copped to the fact that the Democratic Voting Coalition, nationally kind of rests on, this empowered Latino vote on the West Coast, which is very different from, the Latino vote in Texas, which is actually trending more and more Republican. So, when we say like, well, but don't we want to have the best talent? Don't we want to have these people? There's the practical thing of like, we really do have a lot more things to worry about before we're worried about ultimately, foreign nationals who are not U.S. citizens, right? We actually have to prioritize that that issue. But there's a second kind of deeper consideration, which is, what kind of immigration do we want to have to be legal or illegal? There are a lot of Americans who are computer science graduates. There are a lot of Americans who, want to go to medical school. There are a lot of Americans, maybe their parents worked in a factory, maybe their parents were welders, maybe their parents were blue collar, but they're actually, they're working really, really hard. And, if you look at PISA scores or PSAT score distributions, like, people say it's flyover country. It's these like dumb rednecks out in the Midwest or Appalachia. They're actually just a shit ton of smart people in America. Just oodles and oodles and oodles of smart people, and they're not immigrant origin. They're basically defined by British Isles settlers and some waves of German and Irish immigration. But they're just white bread Americans, right? They have been, and this is something that's kind of it's more possible to talk about it now, but they have basically been excluded from just ascension into America's educational and financial pipelines. They're just effectively not allowed to enter them through different means. And I think we would err grievously if we said, well, let's just import a foreign elite who do not share roots in the country in huge numbers, no matter what those numbers are, because it's economically beneficial. I think a genuine component of evaluating any immigrant, regardless of, and I gave you my sort of tiered, wish list. I think a genuine component of evaluating any immigrant, down to the individual level, is like, what does this person think about the country? What do they make of the nation state that they would be joining? Because if we're going to give them membership in this thing called a country, it's a little bit different than a company. If you join Google or Microsoft or OpenAI or Anthropic or any of these large or very impressive companies, yeah, there's a benefits program. There's a vesting schedule. If you get sick, they're going to take care of you. They are not going to kill and die for you, right? There's a very real, this is a thing that has happened as recently as the Vietnam War. There's a very real component of warfare where people need to order and be ordered to just certain death. Not like, hey, this is very dangerous, but like, you are going to die. You are going to die so that this can be protected, that can be protected. Like, it is your job to die. That is a very big sacrifice to make. You can't really make that for an economic zone. You can't really make that for like your vesting schedule, right? That comes down to your membership in a nation. So I'll give you another example. Pramila Jayapal is a Democratic member of the House of Representatives. She was actually born in Tamil Nadu. She's Tamil. She was born in Chennai. I have nothing against the Dravidians. This is not my North Indian, derisiveness or anything like that. But she takes this very negative view of the Second Amendment. She takes a very negative view of the freedom of speech. She showed up here on an airplane. She's not, everything about the United States that made it more attractive for her parents, for her family to come here than remaining in India, which is also true for my family, right? Is a product of, it's a product of so many sacrifices from the time of basically, 1587, the birth of Virginia Dare, the first American actually born. Everything from Roanoke to the Jamestown colony to the War of 1812, the settling of the Midwest, the wars with the Aborigines in the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, all of these things. Think about all of the people who basically just, froze to death in the early settling of the country. Think about all of the people who, died in coal mines and died in oil drilling fields. Think about all of the people who died in the Civil War. They were doing these things to produce a better life for their own country, for their own people, their own nation. And that existed as a coherent national identity really up until 1965, when there was a huge change made to the Immigration and Naturalization Act that allowed so many different kinds of people to come into the country. So it's basically really galling. Like it's like fundamentally morally dirty. It's like, it's not correct for someone to first of all, naturalize, forget even being born here, to naturalize and then turn right around and be like, hey, by the way, we need to completely change, the basis of your constitution and how it's interpreted because I think guns are icky, right? Like, you should really just go back to India. Like, that's my perspective. Like, if she really feels this way, and she'll tell you all about it, if she really feels this way about the Second Amendment, she doesn't belong here. There's a lot of, people will say, well, this is a country defined by immigrants and it's about the American idea. And it's like, well, one of those ideas is surely the right to keep and bear arms. One of those ideas is surely the freedom of speech. One of those ideas is, you could go down the list. And if someone rejects those ideas, forget any other definition of nation or nationalism, they can't be part of it, right? So yeah, it's twofold. And to answer your original question, it's not just that we have practical barriers to immediately addressing the needs of like tech hiring or like large enterprise labor concerns. It's also that we really need to be careful about anyone being melded in at this point, I think, for the sake of national cohesion.
Yeah. Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 40,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, and HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. And you're closing the books in days, not weeks. You're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to your immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/Zen. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/Zen. That's netsuite.com/Zen. Let's talk about scaling digital commerce for a moment. When Mr. Beast launched Feastables, he faced a challenge of scale. How do you build an e-commerce infrastructure that can handle millions of concurrent shoppers, process transactions instantly, and maintain stability during massive traffic spikes? The answer turned out to be deceptively simple: Shopify. Here's what's particularly interesting from a technical perspective. Shopify has built what's become the #1 checkout platform on the planet. They've created a system called ShopPay that's solving one of e-commerce's biggest challenges: cart abandonment. The data shows it's boosting conversions by up to 50%. If you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. On the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between, everything's unified in one robust platform. It's a perfect example of how infrastructure, when done right, becomes a competitive advantage. Upgrade your business and get access to the same checkout system that powers Feastables. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/acognitive, all lowercase. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. So visit shopify.com/cognitive today. Shopify.com/cognitive. And I would say it goes beyond, Facebook getting their engineers, but more just like, are we inventing the next Facebook? Or, we want to be ahead of AI. We want to be ahead on.
I want us to have thousands more Elons. And there are, the thing is, there are, maybe not quite Elon Musk, but like, maybe 2 notches below. I mean, the Diablo headline is like, that is insane, right? I think it's like, of all the other things that he's doing, he's also just clowning on like, much younger people with his actions permitted in this. I mean, it's insane, right? It's like, it's really, we should get a cheek swab. We should try to clone him. But, there are thousands of global talents in the world that we really should try to get. But I think we can't, immigration laws is such a big topic that I think we have to do one thing well and then move on to the next thing that we do well. And the first thing that we do well has to be just getting enforcement right.
What do you say to the pro-immigration arguments? I'm curious where you agree and where you disagree. And let me just outline some of them. I mean, I know you're sympathetic to sort of population arguments more broadly in terms of you're pro-natalist. And when we look at places like Detroit and Cleveland, one of their problems is they don't have a big enough sort of population. And you're concerned about, us not being at replacement rate. And of course, this is not they're not mutually exclusive, but immigration does mean more people, which means more, customers, which mean more consumers, which means more entrepreneurs. because they self-select, they tend to be, more entrepreneurial. They tend to be less crime sort of focused on the average population. Don't they provide all these great services to our economy and to our country?
Yeah, so I think the economic argument, I'll address it later, but I think a lot of that answer exists in the first answer that I gave. As far as like population levels go, the factors of population decline are really interesting because it's, you can look at this in a great population to study this is basically waves of Latino immigration to the United States. And, basically since Latino immigration has been happening from the Latin American countries, you can see the TFRs and like this is literally plotted out, right? Like you can say like white, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, African American, Asian. You can see every wave of Latino immigrants they show up here, they have a TFR that's higher, and then in the next generation it falls, and then in the next generation it falls, and it just keeps falling and falling and falling. And at the same time, in the countries that they're from, they're also actually seeing a huge decrease in the birth rate. And so it's like, actually, I think what's going on is there are components of modernity that select against family formation. Basically, the way we structure life in the Occident, which is much larger than the United States. Actually, even the Occident, even the Western world is too narrow. Like basically, developed industrialized societies. India is now below. It has a below a 2.1 TFR. It's below replacement rate. In modern industrialized societies, and this is something that you can see go like if you look at birth rates from the 1800s, even with the start of the Industrial Revolution, there's something about how society is organized once you instrumentalize women as economic labor outside the home, and you keep running this track of greater and greater educational demands on people before they're allowed to be economically stable through employment. There's something about doing that basically murders fertility. And at the sharp pointy edge of that in modernity, it's like, okay, we have 4-year colleges and corporate employers recruiting people from 4-year colleges offer, they both offer egg freezing to young women. It's like, okay, it's like the causal link is kind of very readily obvious, right? But I would argue it's actually even more subtle. I'm going to write more about this, but I think the right way to interpret, the Industrial Revolution and the sexual revolution were basically linked. One led to the other. And so when people say, okay, well, immigration could be a way to have like stopgap, drops in our fertility. Well, not really, because the same thing is going to happen to those people. But then you actually also have the problems of assimilation. You have the problems of acculturation. And, frankly, you should just want to raise your own people's fertility rate, more than raising the fertility rate of foreign people, right? If you really wanted to have a higher population, why not just, draw a big circle on the map around, Afghanistan and sub-Saharan Africa. And you can just say, yeah, these are now American states. These are part of the United States of America. We're going to give everyone their citizenship, and they have TFRs in the 4s and 5s and 6s. And so our it's basically just not the way you do it, because if you're saying, hey, we have a shortfall in our people reproducing themselves, you can't solve that by having a different people. You need to figure out what's gone wrong in your own society. And I use the phrase "gone wrong" because it is a bad thing, right? You can think of the birth rate as a measure of the probability that any given person will be a happy grandparent to multiple grandchildren, right? If that number is higher, the probability goes up. If that number is very low, that probability goes down. People can make all kinds of arguments about what society is good or not good. Look at grandparents of grandchildren, okay? You're gonna get old. Being a grandparent is not guaranteed, but so yeah, that's a metric I use.
Is your biggest problem with immigration? It's not the economic one as much as it's the cultural one, that we don't do a good job of assimilating, or like what is the biggest problem?
I mean, it's sort of both, right? I mean, like, so I'm want to do this, and I'm sure listeners find it tedious, but like, economics is oikos nomos, right? It's the management of a household. It's like, how do we do stuff to provide for this household? Because that's ultimately, I think it was Samuel Johnson had this observation, the object of politics, of all effort, is to be happy at home, right? What do you even earn money for, right? Why even spend money? Why not just, be an ascetic without any money? Well, that's because you want to do nice things with your friends and family, right? It's less that there are huge economic dislocations brought on by immigration as it is like, what do those economic dislocations mean, right? Allentown, Pennsylvania is a good example of this. It's, by modern conveyances and a Greyhound bus line route, it's basically a bedroom community of New York City, although the people that were living there didn't think of it that way. And in 10 years, basically from 2010 to 2020, Tucker Carlson talked about this on Fox News, and I was like, wow, that's crazy. It went from, essentially 100% non-Hispanic white to 50% non-Hispanic white. And that shift in 10 years was basically entirely illegal immigration and mass migration of largely Venezuelans, but then some others into the community. And, look, the processes which select for an illegal immigrant in the United States has very liberal immigration laws. I mean, like comparatively, like compared to Denmark or Morocco or Japan or like any other country with an airport, we have really lax immigration standards. There are just so many people trying to get in that I'm sure, Indian listeners are like, but what about country kapsar? It's like, okay, yeah, sure. But like literally all of you want to come here. Okay. Like we have such lax immigration standards that the kind of person who is an illegal alien, like there's a lot of adverse selection going into that. Like a lot. And so, it's not a surprise that this community now has, much more crime, much more litter. There's a lot of soft prostitution going on. There's, gang activity. Tren de Aragua is there, right? So is it culture? Is it economics? The answer is both. It's like, think of it like an ecosystem, like a habitat for animals. If your animals are in stasis and they're not exceeding the carrying capacity of their environment, and there are many spots around the watering hole, and they can all get to the fruit in the trees, they're doing okay. And then if you then move in lots of other animals, particularly animals that share their ecological niche, there are going to be problems. Right? This is just, it's like the pigeonhole principle. If you have N pigeonholes and M pigeons and M is greater than N, right? You're going to have extra pigeons, or you're going to have two pigeons in one hole, or, you run out of room, right? And that is the action that causes scarcity. It's what distorts supply and demand, right? Like these things have innate costs. And so it's hard to draw the line between, oh, this neighborhood doesn't feel like my neighborhood anymore because I can't speak English to anyone else in it. And wow, it's actually hard for me to get a retail job because everyone expects me to also speak Spanish, right? These things are much more closely linked and very hard to separate. And the real answer is, people should expect that their government looks out for both of those interests.
And so if we had a better process that could help disentangle, who's actually adding value, we didn't have adverse selection, you would support kind of the numbers that but you don't believe in 1 billion Americans, that there even are 1 billion people in the world who we could bring to America who would act.
No, I don't. One of the reasons I don't subscribe to 1 billion Americans is like just in terms of just, I mean, if you have listeners in England who are a little bit more, scrutin inclined, I guess we'll say, like there is fundamental value in not paving over, every last square inch of greenery, right? Like it's actually a good thing to have wilderness in your country. It's a good thing to have, Europeans discover this when they come to the United States, right? That you take them to an American suburb and we think like, oh, how cramped, you basically get no room in a suburb. It's not like living out in the country. And people from, relatively, urbane cities in Europe will look around and they'll be like, oh my God, like you have, what is a yard? You have a pool? Like they can't believe it, right? The European mind cannot comprehend this because they really are just all living on top of each other. And then if you're from Egypt, if you're from Syria, if you're from India, oh my God, you take them to these places and like they go wild. And it's actually good to have room. It's a better way to live, to have, room to stretch your legs and for, kids to be able to play on the grass and, build snowmen out in the yard. It's not actually so great for everyone to be, cramped in Neo Tokyo Blade Runner style apartments. That's good for a certain season of life. it's really not good for a nation as a whole.
I also want to talk about something else we mentioned, which is this idea that you had, which I struggle to grasp, which is why should we prioritize someone whose parents have been here many more generations than someone who's only been here, a couple of generations, like ourselves, perhaps. Yeah, why does that matter?
So this is sort of even broader than immigration. It's basically a consequence of nationalism, right? And like you basically believe in the idea of a nation or you don't. Right. And there are a lot of people who, they look at a country or they look at a polity, right? And they're like, well, Germany is a polity that began to exist in 1990 and it has the basic law and kids go to school and, maybe they go to Hauptschule and maybe they get their Vordiplom and then, or maybe they go to Abitur and then they become citizens of the Bundesrepublik, right? And it's like, no, actually, Germany is like 1,000 years old. It's like there's a lot of history. You should learn about. It wasn't always called Kaliningrad, right? It was actually Königsberg, and there's, there is actually, Tacitus didn't call it Germania, out of his ass, right? Like that's not a coincidence. There is a people here, right? India did not start existing in the 1940s. China did not start existing in the 1950s, right? Like. And America, did not start existing in 1776. Sometimes you get the impression that people think America only started existing in 1945. And everything that came before that, doesn't matter, isn't real. I think this is basically a matter of inclination and self-interest. I totally get why some people who are just here to earn money and speak English and live in multiple different cities and travel around and are very cosmopolitan. I get why that sort of person, finds the idea of nationalism hilarious. My favorite globalist, I do have a favorite globalist. I like him a lot. He's very charismatic. It's Carlos Ghosn. And years ago, he gave an interview where someone said, where are you from? And he was like, well, it's not so much one country, it's different cities. I'm a mixture of, Rio de Janeiro, Tokyo, Beirut, and Paris, right? And, and he was like, let me tell you about the revival of Nissan next, right? And, he's a Lebanese man who speaks Japanese and is a gourmand for French food, right? I get why someone like that would be like, nationalism, how silly. At the same time, all of the things that produced the United States of America are basically a result of American nationalism. And this is like axiomatically true, right? Because like the reason there is a United States of America and not, the greater British, territories or whatever is because of American nationalism. American nationalism basically begins with King Philip's War or the war with Metacom, right? Where these, British settlers, they have to figure out their common defense against the French and the French and the Indians. And they essentially form this like prototypical state and they have to think of themselves as a nation. And Great Britain is not really a big part of that.
Aren't we also a nation of immigrants too? I mean, we were talking about Elon Musk. Elon Musk is an immigrant, the entrepreneur.
People will often say, we're a nation of immigrants. And then, people on the right will say, no, that's never true. We've never been a nation of immigrants. It's settlers. Martin Van Buren, his first language was Dutch, right? It's not entirely true that, every single founding father was, an Anglo, there was a little bit of diversity. These things are true. The DuPont family, it's a very French name, the Normans and Anglo-Saxons mixed, but when people say we're a nation of immigrants, there is a fundamental difference between being an immigrant and being a settler. It's kind of like the difference between look, I'm one of the first 1,000 employees, or like, no, I'm a co-founder, right? Or like I'm on the founding team. I think most of your listeners understand why there is a huge split in equity between like the last guy to join before the IPO, who still gets life-changing outcomes, right? If it's like if all goes well, and like the first 10 people who have been here the entire time, and actually the seed investors who have like the senior waterfall position on that cap table, right? Like, why is that? Basically, it's because it's a risk-reward gradient, right? For most of the history of the United States, for most of the existence of America, things were not so great. This idea of America as a comfortable place to live, as a nice place to live, as a desirable place to live, go back to 1860 and tell people that. If you were in Europe, if you were in, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, if you were in the British Empire, if you were, frankly, many Asian countries, right? If you told them, yeah, living in a shack in Missouri, it's like, this is the high life. They'd be like, are you fucking nuts? Like, no way. And really, the only people who thought that way were the absolute poorest in Europe, right? Like really bottom of the barrel. And so, the idea that, yes, in a civic sense, right? My parents came here in the 80s and naturalized, and I was born here. And, I was born in America to US citizens, the same as, Donald Trump, right? He also has, he's also immigrant origin in some sense, right? And aren't we just as American as everyone else? Yeah, I sure, in a civic sense, but in a deeper national sense, right? It's like, come on, right? When you really get down to it, like everyone kind of knows. And it's why people get a little bit hysterical in these conversations if you bring these topics up, because they start to feel a little bit of fear about, oh my God, is my position in this country in jeopardy? And it's like, no, it's not. But like, maybe we shouldn't have, 20 million people from the rest of the world show up every single year.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
There are over 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the United States and millions more around the world. How do you know which ones can make the biggest impact with your donation? GiveWell was founded to help donors with that exact question. They pore over independent studies and charity data to help donors direct their funds to evidence-backed organizations that are saving and improving lives. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. If you've never used GiveWell to donate, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick podcast and enter Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Erik Torenberg at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from Econ 102 to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lanahan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For backend, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork, billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
I feel like separate police. Like I think it's totally reasonable to say, hey, we should totally lock down our borders, but I don't see why that is in the same conversation as, oh, people who've been here for 100 years longer.
Well, it's like, what is the country for? Like, why would it be a bad thing to have completely open borders, right? I think it would be a bad thing because it would mean the people here have no control over their destiny. It would mean that their economic situation, their cultural situation, everything would just be up for grabs, right? Why would it be such a terrible thing for, any random person in Oakland to move into your apartment? Is he not a fellow human being? The man, the man on the corner in Oakland, and it's like, okay, but it's my apartment, right? It's like, don't I get to have anything to myself? You would say as the swarms, crossed over the bridge and you came into. I'm assuming you're in SF right now. Maybe you're in Tiburon, I don't know. But like, but yeah, it's don't you get to have a home is ultimately the question, right? And if you have a home, you get to say who's allowed in your home or not. And if you have a home with your family, you get to say who's allowed to be in your home and who's family and who's not family. And that's much more what a country is, right? Again, we spoke about these obligations of nationhood, right? It's much more what a country is than even a company. But even at a company, we kind of understand that there's this gradient of like who took on the most risk versus reward.
Yep. Let's analyze this analogy a little bit more, because country as a family, I can understand a small, Estonia but are you family with Nicole Hannah-Jones? Or like, are you family? Republicans, Democrats, they hate each other, right? They don't get married to each other. They don't. And then also it's like my family can't, I love my family, but they're not going to build SpaceX, or they're not going to like, my family's not going to invent, the things that America hasn't, like, they're not going to make America great. We would die for each other, but we're not like companies are how you and Nicole Hannah-Jones can operate in a society where you can function, right? Capitalism is how people who are not related.
So I don't think that's totally true, right? So like, a lot of people who make this argument, they're like, look, I go to the Google campus, or, I go to, this, lunch hall of this company, and I see people, it's like, this guy's name is, Chitrawal, and that person's name is like Kim, and that person's name is Salazar, and that person's name is McClellan. And they, it's a common theme. You hear this sort of like Gene Roddenberry Star Trek liberalism, where they're like, oh my God, look at these people's faces are even shaped differently. They're so different, and yet they're all working towards this one common goal. That's America, right? And that's not really what a nation is. That's what a company is. And you can get fired from a company. You can get sued by a company. Like it's not what a country is. And when people say like, oh, but Nicole Hannah-Jones and you have nothing in common, it's like, okay, that's fine, but they're individuals, right? It's not really the case that nationalism only makes sense for small nations. China is not a small nation. Japan is not a small nation. There are 80 million Germans. Most of them are still actually German and not Turkish, right? Nationalism is really not a result of scale. It's a result of it's a result of time spent together. It's a result of coherent identity.
And America's supposed to be famous for our ability to assimilate, and maybe we've stopped doing that as well as we should have. But
people say this, if you look at the measure of immigration law from, the first immigration law in this country was the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1789, which basically spells out like, look, free white persons can come to this country, right? Like right out the gate, the United States is not, free for all. But, through the years, basically, like if any of your listeners can do this, don't take my word for it. Look up all of the immigration laws that the United States had from 1789 to 1954, 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act. The reason the United States was so good at assimilating immigrants is because you had small numbers of immigrants coming to a ever increasingly defined and industrialized Anglo nation, right? And in fact, it basically had zero welfare. It had total cultural confidence. It had the numbers to back it up. And, it sent people home. In 1954, this is a real thing that happened. General Eisenhower, and I bring him up because so many times people will make, allusions to the Nazis or this or that or the other thing. Eisenhower defeated the Nazis. He initiated one of the largest deportation operations in history. That was like an actual roundup of illegal aliens called I'm not making it. It's called Operation Wetback. That was the actual name that they used in 1954, right? The way we assimilated immigrants, it's like, there were actually there were pro-immigration people who proposed something called Americanization Day. There's this famous, if you Google Thomas LOC Congress Americanization Day, many people's one language. Thomas is the name of the Library of Congress lookup system. If you put into Google, it'll come up. It's this wonderful poster, and it has, Polish and Russian and Spanish and French, all these things on it. And it's the Cleveland, Ohio Americanization Committee has a propaganda poster that's like, take your European yokel parents to the night school and make them learn English because this is American. We speak English here. And that was a pro-immigrant movement, Americanization Day. They wanted immigrants to come here. They just also wanted them to speak English. That's a very different country than one where, oh, actually, by dint of mass immigration, we've completely changed the demographics, and you have to press 1 for English, press 2 for Spanish, right? It's so, when people say like, yeah, this is a country of immigrants and we've been so good at assimilating immigrants. Yeah, because up until like yesterday in the national history, this was an almost entirely Anglo-American country. And it let people know that, and it made no apology for it.
And so when you argue with someone who we're both friends with and respectively Balaji about this, where do you differ from his perspective?
Oh, I won't speak for Balaji. I don't even want to advance what I think would be our disagreement about this. I think in broad strokes, he would say, look, the really important thing is that, this whole idea of Western values or America or like, nationalism, it's like it's time has passed. And the really important thing is that if you go to like an internet conference or like a tech conference in like, Tokyo or Dubai or Singapore or, San Francisco, lots and lots of people who speak English, who believe in freedom of speech, who believe in, free market capitalism. They all share a common language and culture, but that culture is more internet culture. It's not really American culture. And this is the future. And nations as a way to organize people are really kind of less real than these chosen affiliations. Again, I don't want to speak for him, but I think that's what he would say. And what I would say is, when you have, when certain things become commodity valued, the things that are, when they become sort of completely common and easy to get and unremarkable, things that are innate and things that are hard to get and things that really have an essence of identity actually become much more valuable and much more salient, and they explain much more of the variance between people. So I'll give you an example. In the world, we have 8 billion human beings, and they have 200 or so some countries, and those countries have passports, and those passports have negotiated agreements about who's allowed to travel where and to what, right? And the United States has a fairly strong passport, and Kenya has a fairly weak passport, right? If you're a Kenyan national and you have a Kenyan passport, you need to apply to a lot of visas, and you have to go through a lot of rigmarole to visit other countries. Whereas if you have an American passport, they basically assume you're not coming to illegally immigrate into other countries, right? If the whole world were to be issued U.S. passports, we'd figure out something besides U.S. passports actually to figure out who we want coming to, Denmark would be like, okay, I guess we're not using just the US passport now, right? Because that's actually a meaningless thing. So I think actually as the world becomes more and more closely connected, as movement becomes much easier, because that seems, all of our technologies, all of our telecommunications technologies and transportation technologies and educational technologies seem to be bringing the world vastly closer together. I think the things that make people different will have greater and greater salience. And national memberhood is one of those things, because you kind of can't fake what your last 10 generations of ancestry are. You kind of can't fake, what your civic or ethnic holidays are, or what your liturgical language is. And so really meaty definitions of nation, I think, will actually have increased salience in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm trying to think, what else should we talk about as it relates to this topic? And I'm trying to even flush out the disagreements or summarize even the disagreements that we might have. One is I don't really buy the difference in any material way in terms of like what we should, or that would have any policy implementations or otherwise between someone who's been here 3 generations and someone who's been here 10. I do share your concern around, importing Venezuelan gangs, like I or whatever. Like I do think, or even a lot of like unproductive.
Yeah, I think part of the hesitation is it's like, it's like, well, my ancestors came here in 1910 to Ellis Island. Aren't I just as much of an American at this point as someone whose ancestors came here on the Mayflower? And isn't it a little weird for you to suggest that I retain some, black mark of foreignness, and I even come up in the same conversation when it comes to national identity as like a Tren de Aragua member, right? Like that's kind of, and that's not what I'm saying, right? I understand the sensitivity to that, right? Like I also come from somewhere else, quite recently, right?
You're not going to leave this country, right? Like you're not going to self-deploy.
Yeah, I'm actually coming to you live from Bombay. I deported myself on November 6th. I'm just that much of a patriot, right? On my own dime. Yeah, no, look, sometimes you have to make law. This will sound like a non sequitur. It's not. Nancy Mace and the transgender bathroom stuff, right? Nancy, I know, right? Your listeners are like, shut the fuck up, Bronson. This is totally a non sequitur. Okay, it's not. I promise. Nancy Mace is not going to comment on her figure, but you know who Nancy Mace is. Nancy Mace is a congresswoman, and she's doing this thing now. She's saying like, look, only biological women in the bathrooms, because there's this other congresswoman as a congressman who's mentally ill, Tim McBride, now going by Sarah McBride. It's a guy who has a sexual fetish and he dresses up as a woman. And he calls himself a trans woman. This is this whole thing, right? And she's saying like, this is so messed up. This is totally weird. Why does he get to go into the bathroom with like female members of Congress? Isn't this crazy? And I hope Nancy May succeeds. I hope she keeps Tim McBride out of. And it looks like she may succeed. The policy that Speaker Johnson has put forth is going to be like, look, don't go into the opposite sex bathroom. But when you look into Nancy Mace's personal history, she was the first female to attend not the service academy, but the senior military college of the Marine Corps called the Citadel. She didn't go to Annapolis, which I believe at the time was open to female entrants. And she didn't become a Marine by, enlisting and just being a female Marine, which I think was also available in 1995. She, because her volume was actually due to become the headmaster of the school, she petitioned very strongly to be the first female graduate, the first female admit of the Citadel. And there's actually a scandal a couple of months before with someone else, but she did. She got in, and she and another woman, they graduated from the Citadel as United States Marine officers, right? And I would submit to you that like Nancy Mace, along with Tim McBride, she's also a trans woman in some sense, right? Like she lived the life of a man in imitation of that because of the valor associated with them, right? She wanted that associate, like she didn't become like a 0302 Marine infantry officer. She didn't go to IOC. She didn't lead Marines in combat or anything like that, right? She was a business major. She went on to have like a career and become a politician, right? But she wanted to be a Marine, and she cut her hair short, and she actually wrote this book called In the Company of Men, and she actually details like kind of living as a man. She was basically cross-dressing. And I would argue the push, to integrate the services and to actually have women in combat roles is a form of cross-dressing. Now, why do I bring that up? I'm not saying that there aren't women who aren't strong, right? I'm not saying that there aren't women who, look, frankly, 5.56 is not a terribly recoiling round. We've moved to the M4. It's like, a child can use it. It's like it's not a, but why would we have ever had the social construction that says only men can go to the Citadel and become Marines? Why would we have ever had this social construction that says only men can serve in combat roles in the military? Only men can even be in the military, right? Those are social constructions that reify and solidify a biological distinction. Even if an individual is like so terrific as a woman that she can keep up with the boys, that social construction said, no, this is a male-only thing. The role of men is to be built for war and to do this, and the role of women is to do something else. And a capital L liberal framework of looking at the world, through a moral lens, looks at that and says, this is unjust, because this social construction denies a woman her expression of her individual urges, which is, maybe to go and be a Marine and graduate from the Citadel and do all of this stuff. And so this social construction was deconstructed by people like Nancy Mace and others, right? The mass integration of of women into the military and then into combat roles and leadership and all of these things, right? Deconstructed what was formerly a male-only space. And the thing is, when you have a biological prior or a material prior with the social constructions and you get rid of those social constructions so that you can have Nancy Mace be a Marine, even though she's a young woman who menstruates, right? And is clearly not suited to being a Marine in combat. You end up developing other social constructions on top of it, right? And so, much more recently, Marines who, expressed concerns about the physical fitness requirements being changed to accommodate female Marines to get them into combat MOSs, they got a lot of heat from their senior leadership because it's like, hey, are you implying that your sisters in arms are not as good as you, right? These other social constructions come in to sort of back up this new material distinction. So, when you play games with social constructions for the sake of expediency, because you say, hey, well, this material reality at the individual level, I can find an exception to the rule. And so this whole social construction needs to go. When you do that, you're breaking a lot more than just that particular instance.
Right. It's back to immigration.
Yeah. So Ilhan Omar is an is an American. She was born in Mogadishu, right? Like, the Pramila Jayapal is an American. Alejandro Mayorkas is an American, born in Cuba, right? Like, these people are now, they're trans Americans. Basically, they identify as being, their civic identity is that they are Americans, right? And all I'm pointing out as a trans American myself is like, look, we're trans Americans, okay? We're not really cis Americans, right? Like,
What makes it Americans is that they hate America, or they
right, exactly, right. And it's like, there are a lot of trans Americans hopping the border who are like, I want to use the American bathroom, right? But like, you see what I mean, right? It's like yes, you can always find individual exceptions to a material reality, right? Whether it's saying like, oh, but this guy's, he's basically an American, or like, but she's one of the guys, or like whatever. You can
Elon Omar hates American values. They're but a Cuban who votes Trump or is free speech.
Sure, exactly. Yeah, you can find, I like it's harder with the transgender example because like you just look at them and it's like that's a dude in a dress, right? Like, but you can always find edge cases where you say, hey, look, the material reality is not so black and white, and so this black and white social construction needs to go. But when you tear down that social construction, you're ultimately you're tearing it down in favor of other social constructions that will reify other material distinctions, and you're changing so much. And it's generally speaking, you need to follow the Chesterton's fence rule, which is really you need to understand why these distinctions exist before you start tearing them down. And I think part of what we need to level with is having a completely culturally incoherent country, having a completely politically divided country, having a country that has no sense of national ethos, where everyone is just out for themselves and the country is more like a shopping mall or a bus stop than a national home, is not actually a good thing. And, the United States now faces competitors, specifically, faces China, right? China is, it's like 95% Han. And people will say, "Oh, but Chinese isn't a language." It's like, okay, but they all have Putongpa. They all they all read opinion. And there's a great military commercial, a recruitment commercial. I'll try to find it for you, but it's like I am a Chinese soldier, and it's like what do I fight for? And it's like I fight for a good life. I fight for China, and you should really, I think people should watch that commercial. One, it's a very moving commercial. It's very beautifully produced, but it's like. Two, it's like it's basically an impossible commercial to produce in the United States. It's impossible now to recruit on that basis because no one really knows what the nation is.
Right. I agree. But the same strength is also their weakness. They can't import the thousands of Elon Musks. They're limited to their native population. But I also agree that our weakness is it's much harder to have national cohesion when we are a bunch of different, nationalities.
So I tend to think of global power as it's like a function in three variables, right? So you have you have scale, capacity, and unity, right? So you have f of s, c, and u, right? And this function tells you what your global power is going to be, and maybe call it g sub f or something, right? And so it's like, okay, what is scale? Scale is basically how big are you guys? Like, how many national resources do you have? How many people do you have? How much territory do you have? What is capacity? Capacity is kind of like, what's the mean IQ of a high school graduate in your country, right? What is the lean mass of a baby that is born in your country? How what is the life expectancy of people in your country, right? This is your capacity. This is like, what kind of material are you working with? And then there's unity. And unity is like, when people in this polity hear the national anthem, what percentage of them get a little misty-eyed, right? Like, the United States actually has a lot of strengths in this regard, right? Like, if you play the national anthem in like the right way, and not with like the breathy female singers, if you play it in like, the military quartet way, or if you play that that French horn section from like Black Hawk Down, like it's waterworks, right? And that's programmed into you very early, and it stays with you for the rest of your life. Believe the United States did is it tried to improve on the dimension of capacity and scale at the expense of unity. And the thing is, I think the variable that matters the most in that function is actually unity, particularly in this technological moment, right? Like we are entering a world where, cognitive ability and mechanical production, golly, right? Like the entire industrial revolution and the entire digital revolution, right, was basically to say, like the ballad of John Henry, like, fuck your delts, right? Like, we're gonna build a machine that can actually drive these railroad spikes, right? There's no ballad of John Henry for like, oh, the Rubik's Cube is solved faster, but we're actually commodifying, even cognitive ability. And what is the big problem that emerges now in AI and like worries of killer robotics? Oh, it's alignment. We need to make tools safe. We need to make tools aligned. We need to, like, what is that? That is basically saying, are there high fidelity outputs for our inputs, right? That's culture. They're basically talking about robot culture, and this idea of like unsafe actors or whatever. It's like, those are people that disagree with you. That's what they're talking about is culture. They're talking about unity. And so I think actually we're getting to the point where, even international trade is like this, right? Oh, your country doesn't have phosphorus? Great. You can have a massive ship come with drums of phosphorus for you. Okay. Like, we figured these problems out. So I think it's actually a very bad thing to degrade unity for the purpose of capacity or scale, because you basically just want to increase your own people's capacity over time, and scale, that's what capitalism is for. And if you take the shortcut of importing new people, you make it much harder to coordinate. You get basically national schizophrenia.
We're at the hour. I think that's a great place to wrap. Bronson, this has been a great conversation as always. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.